Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are excited that so many of you could join us today for our conversation, Multicultural Women's Voices on Ecological and Social Healing. I'm Pele Shalev, the Events Manager for the Public Programs Department of the California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university in San Francisco. We may be joining from different places all over the world, and as a representative of CIIS, I want to start off by expressing our debt and gratitude to the Ramaytush Ohlone, the original peoples and continual caretakers of the San Francisco Peninsula. CIIS campus is located on the traditional unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone, which they call Yalamu. In the Ramaytush Ohlone language, Yalamu identifies both the people and the territory. This acknowledgement is only a single small step towards being in deeper connection and relationship with Indigenous tribes and organizations in our community, and does not begin to acknowledge all the native lands, languages, and territories where you are right now, or where you live and work every day. I invite you to take a moment now to acknowledge the land where you reside, and to commit to learn more about the native communities near you and to support their work. If it feels right for you to share in the chat, please do. We always recommend native-land.ca as a starting resource. Before we start, I want to go over a few general tips and troubleshooting items. We will have a Q&A after the conversation tonight. Please submit your questions at any time using our anonymous web form, which is linked in the event description below this video. We'll be pulling questions from that form, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. We do have automatically generated captions for this event, which you can toggle on and off using the closed captioning button in YouTube. Chat will be enabled during this event, but please note that it is not being moderated and our presenters cannot see the chat. Chat is not required to fully experience the event. If you choose to participate in chat, please be respectful and avoid language that could be offensive or insensitive to others. You can turn the chat off at any time, and we encourage you to do so if you find it negatively impacting your experience in any way. If you're having issues with your audio or video, we always suggest that you start by refreshing the page. And then if you still have issues, we suggest that you adjust your video settings within YouTube. Now, let me first introduce our presenters, Jeanine Canty, Alka Arora, and Sara Salazar, and then we'll get right to the conversation. Dr. Alka Arora is a professor of women, gender, spirituality, and social justice at CIIS. Her research and teaching are focused on liberatory pedagogy, feminist spiritual activism, socially conscious leadership, and critical animal studies. She has a background in intergroup dialogue facilitation and is a certified gender equity and reconciliation international facilitator. She is also a workshop leader, personal development and leadership coach, and educational consultant. She lives in Chicago, Illinois. Sara H. Salazar, PhD, is a Xicana scholar, educator, and mother. Her work is transdisciplinary and focused on decolonial theory and praxis, feminist philosophy, and critical pedagogies. Sara's research interests include Xicana spirituality, art, and activism, radical mothering practices, and Indigenous food systems and restorative justice. She is an associate professor of interdisciplinary studies in the School of Undergraduate Studies at CIIS. Jeanine M. Canty, PhD, is a professor of transformative studies at CIIS, telecommuting from Boulder, Colorado. Formerly the chair of environmental studies at Naropa University, she continues to teach at Naropa and at Pacifica Graduate Institute. A lover of nature, justice, and contemplative practice, her teaching intersects issues of social and ecological justice, eco-psychology, and the process of worldview transformation. She's the author of Returning the Self to Nature, Undoing Our Collective Narcissism and Healing Our Planet, and her most recent edited book is an expanded second edition of Ecological and Social Healing, Multicultural Women's Voices. And now it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Jeanine Canty, Alka Arora, and Sara Salazar.
Thank you so much, Pele, and thank you everyone so much for coming this evening. And thank you to CIS and CIS public programs. It's just such an honor to be in dialogue. And I want to especially thank Sara and Alka, of course, and all the contributors to our book. And I do want to start off with kind of a tender honoring and thank you. One of our contributors to this book is the iconic, renowned ecofeminist Susan Griffin, who passed away yesterday. So pretty sad. She was in her 80s and just such a lovely being, brilliant. And so last night I was just I decided to reread her essay. And if you've never read Susan Griffin, she has, I think, 21 books. So read one of those. But in her essay, she just had this really sweet little story. And I thought I'd just start with a bit of it because I really envisioned her passing in this image. So she said, one of my earliest and most indelible memories is of standing in a field near our house in the San Fernando Valley, which was not yet in those days, the late 40s, entirely covered with tract houses and shopping malls. Just 5 years old, I found myself alone, 2 blocks from home, and slightly frightened, though too enthralled with the way the wind swept through the tall green grass that surrounded me on every side to be captured by the fear. So, yeah, just envisioning Susan surrounded by those waving, windswept tall grasses on her current journey. And I'd also like to start with just reading the invocation from our book. To all the women and femmes of color who feel heartbreak for Earth and all her beings and are enchanted by visions of new possibilities, you are seen and loved. May the muck of these times usher in the resurgence of the feminine. To all of the ancestors, deities, and elementals invoked within these pages, your presence was felt throughout this book's creation. To Mother Earth and all her beings, thank you for your forceful rumblings and fierce love while we reconnect in right relationship. Hmm. Okay, so for this evening, we're going to get into some dialogue. And first, I'm going to do a little framing of our work. You probably all know right now that it's about this book, Ecological and Social Healing, Multicultural Women's Voices. And it's a second expanded edition. And I was so excited that both Sara and Alka agreed to be in this new version, and we've got lots of new contributors, and it spans 4 generation of folks from their 30s through their 80s, both women of color and some Anglo contributors as well, and we all hold multiple positionalities. And the book really comes out of our intersections between working with both social and ecological issues uh, through our experiences of our race and other gender, obviously, and other positionalities. And I'll just read a little bit of the introduction. It's birthed out of the conditions we were each born into, and it moves beyond the breakdowns and criticisms of these conditions, going into the healing and emerging insights. The work here honors the uniqueness of our circumstances and gives voice and freedom to the new patterns and wisdom that come from living on the edges, these edges between ecological and social histories. And so throughout this creation, we really focused on this sub-theme of edges of transformation and really looking at like what's blooming with our collection here. And so back to the intro. This theme has many lenses. Permaculture often claims that everything interesting happens at the edges between ecosystems. Transformative learning acknowledges that our worldviews change through having experiences that confront our identities and force us to make meaning. And edges also represent crossing into liminal spaces, stepping into the mystery of nature, spirit, and our psyches, not knowing what we may encounter. And edges, they're often hard, whether in sensory sharpness or through the psychological fear of transitioning into a different reality. Nor are edges seamless transitions. They do not embody the conventional sense of wholeness. Edges are often formed when something breaks, such as a rock formation or a held sense of personal and collective identity. And so, as we are moving to restore our relationship with nature, including one another in an extremely diverse, globally connected planet, um, often the knowledge we need is held by those that are crossing boundaries between fixed viewpoints, restoring relationships with place, holding multiple ways of being, and reintegrating feminine wisdom. And so we currently have generations of people who straddle multiple edges, varied identities that consist of unique combinations of the Indigenous and multicultural, the colonized and colonizer, the displaced and the reclaimer. And our authors, we represent the joining of multiple communities, histories, and identities. Okay, so I'm gonna ask Alka uh, and then Sara. We started working on this collection in the late 2023, and we finished our pieces long before our most recent US election. And so, Alka, in your perspective, how has our current reality affected the relevance of our work here?
Such a great question, Jeanine, because of course that's what's in everybody's minds these days as we kind of, watch the horrors that we're seeing unfolding in the news every single day. Um, I think my answer to that is somewhat multi-layered. I mean, I think on the one hand, we've seen our current administration roll back a number of environmental regulations that have been very hard won over the years, things like protecting endangered species, putting limits on oil and other extractive companies. In particular, concern for my work in animal ethics. Just earlier this year in July, the Trump administration filed a lawsuit against California because of the state's egg laws, which said that all eggs sold within California must come from cage-free hens. And the Department of Justice has alleged that these regulations are actually, hiking up egg prices nationwide. So there's this like conflict that's being between profit and, increasing the welfare of animals and other parts of non-human life. Now, on the other hand, right, I see the issues that we're addressing in this collection as going much, much deeper than what's happening in the current election cycle. Our disconnection from and exploitation of nature and animals has been around long before our current regime and would still be there if the other party had won, though there might have been, there's some modifications, some minor limits. Okay, there needs to be out of cages, but the chickens can still be crowded, right? So these are like somewhat minor tweaks in some ways that I see. And I'm not saying that these things aren't important, right? But I think that the kind of work that your collection really speaks to is a much, much deeper transformation of consciousness that goes beyond what either main political party is able to offer, right? So I think like we need to have kind of a both and approach. Yes, we can resist, what's being done to roll back these protections, but recognize that really the work of transformation is going to be happening outside of, just who's the current, politician beholden to extractive multinational corporations and power. Um, and and how that's going to change at the top, at the levels of greater power, is when the change happens more at the individual and community level, which I really see, all the authors in this collection talking about is individuals, communities reconnecting to their spirits, to their ancestral lineages, to each other, to the world outside of our computers, as much as we love our computers, right? And so I think that our work is always been urgent, and it continues to be urgent. And I think if anything, we might want to sort of employ the current concern that's bubbling up among many aspects of the population, particularly the youth, for what's happening to our planet, uh, to really, plant seeds of deeper transformation so that, the pendulum will swing much further than we might ever have thought it could the other way. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Alka. Yeah, kind of taking that all in. Sara, what are your thoughts on this? How do you see the relevance of our work here in terms of since the election?
Yeah, thank you, Jeanine. Thanks for that question. Also, when we were writing the book, I thought, man, this is such a wonderful time to be delving deeply into these topics. And now, as we sit here, I think, wow, that this book could not have come at a better time in history, because this is really marking a particular moment, not for just us, the United States, but globally. And I think what's really important about this book is that it really centers the voices of many people who've been in the margins, right, for generations. And so I think that's very exciting about this book. My particular chapter, as you know, was on Xicana mothering, intergenerational connections, land, food. And, of course, Ken, as Alka said, we could go down the list of all the things that are happening currently. But I think, with relationship to my chapter, I think the loss of reproductive rights among women, which has really created fear of being pregnant, getting pregnant, the fear of miscarriage, fear of birthing. And, because of the forced displacements that are happening within the Chicano community and other BIPOC communities, the fear of being separated from our children is very real in many of our communities. And so it's not, it's happening right now. And I think that fear, right, is powerful. And so I think that this book, really helps to situate and speak to our experiences, as many of us are from the margins. And I think it also speaks to this idea of forced displacement from our land, from our communities, from our family members, in addition, to forced displacement from our children. And so I think this helps these communities, helps my community, right? Speak into that, right? Speak power into these places in which many of our rights have been taken away, right? And continue to be as we speak. So I think that's, just a couple of the ways in which this book is so relevant right now.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sara.
Jeanine, I wonder how you would answer this question, having been the one to, solicit contributions and, curate this, and what are your thoughts about its relevance right now?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because the first edition came out really in 2016, but it's got a 2017 publication date. And then when our publisher approached about doing this one, they said, it was ahead of your time before, but now it's so your time. But listening to both of you, I totally echo what you say, that it's so important for now, and also carrying us through this time. There's been so many kind of moments this year where I've actually just picked up the book, or what was that thing from so and so's chapter, because it really brings so much kind of tooling, inspiration, visions. I agree with what Alka was saying, and kind of that the rug was being was kind of just pulled up from us, but in like a quicker manner. But it was still, things were falling apart globally, and definitely nationally. So really recognizing that, and reading the book and some of the inspirations that come up for me. Definitely doubling down on the ways that we practice, the ways we create community, and sparking collective healing. My favorite phrases from the book that I'm always going back to in terms of that, and some of these are yours, are terms like aquaphilia, attention liberation, autochthonic intimacy, autotopography. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong, Sarah. Blue
You got it.
spaces. Oh, good. Blue spaces, disorienting dilemmas, getting dirty, haptic cognition, Kairos time, kinsanity, living kind, playful fabulista, soft fascination, yin yang. And so it's for me creating like so many possibilities and also just realities. And in my chapter, I focus so much around transformative learning and paradigms. And right now, it feels like that's something that we all need to be doubling down, or at least I do, in terms of there's so many kind of fixed worldviews, fear, and we need to work with like humanity around the pliability of our worldviews and really tool up with that, with a lot of love and ferocity.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, Alka, I'm going to ask you, your chapter is called Living Kind, a spiritual and political journey, and it centers around your work with integral feminist vegan pedagogy. And so could you frame what this is and also read perhaps a section from your chapter?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I first want to give props to the African activist Taliba Ogunbala, whose work I found in the work of womanist Layli Maiparan, who coined the term living kind as one word, right? So, and she talks about it in the way of like moving from not just humankind, but living kind, all living beings. And so my title, I love wordplay, is a little bit of a play on words, living kindly, two words, as well as like moving from, I think the big feminist move was moving from the idea of mankind to humankind, right? There's not just one type of human that needs to be at the center. And this work, that one of the things that I'm really passionate about is shifting all our social justice work to moving beyond just the human realm to embrace all of living kind. And I think for me, this is a deeply spiritual as well as political process, because our spiritual traditions, many of them do emphasize the interconnectedness of all life. And in my chapter, I have very personal pieces in there talking about, growing up as a sensitive child and really like being very attuned to when I would hear about the suffering of animals, and then coming into consciousness as a teenager about like the horrors of factory farms and how that so much of that sensitivity in industrial cultures, and I mean many cultures in many ways, is sort of um, conditioned out of us, as this is just the way that it is. There's so many human issues. How can we even dare to consider the non-human animal realm? And so I want to now tease apart those different words in the phrase integral feminist vegan pedagogy, because it's somewhat academic to a certain extent. The term integral at CIIS and elsewhere is really about recognizing the connection between different aspects like mind and body and spirit, and challenging the sort of false binaries or splits between these, right? And so for me, integral is also about the connections between the human and the animal, as well as the feminist and the vegan. And I talk about my integration of those two parts of me within the chapter. But I want to talk specifically about, some of the connections between issues of human social justice and animal justice. And what I talk about in my chapter is this concept that, many people have heard the phrase hurt people, right? And what I wrote was that hurting animals hurts people. And there's been research that indicates that slaughterhouse workers, many of them experience something called perpetration-induced traumatic stress, which is a form of PTSD experienced by those who have been involved in causing harm to others. And of course, there's many issues in food production, lots of exploitation, even in the plant sector. But this is a particularly egregious form of ways in which human exploitation or human suffering is tied to the suffering of non-human animals. Many of us are aware, that animal agriculture is a massive environmental justice issue, considered one of the greatest, if not the greatest, contributor to man-made climate change, massive effects on water pollution, water shortages, as well as feeding into global hunger because of the amount of food that could be raised to feed humans that's fed to, basically fatten up animals in factory farms. And one of the other things that I really am passionate about doing in my chapter, as well as in my teaching, is challenging this notion that I've seen sort of circulate in some, spaces, particularly around social justice, that being vegan is a white privilege stance, and I want to say there's a little partial truth to that. Some of the vegan goodies out there can be very high priced and only available in certain neighborhoods. But the deeper issue of being connected to the land and connected to animals, it transcends, it's applicable to all peoples. And in fact, Black folks are one of maybe the fastest growing population of folks who identify as vegan or plant-based for health as well as political issues. So I talked about the integral, the feminist, and the vegan. I want to talk a little bit about why pedagogy is relevant here before I read some pieces from it. As someone who's been an educator for a long time, one of the things that I really feel very strongly about is that pointing fingers and, hitting people over the head with admonitions of this, you shouldn't do this, or you shouldn't eat that, or whatever, it just doesn't work, right? And vegans have this bad reputation of being a judgmental lot. And, there's all kinds of different vegans, all kinds of different plant-based eaters. But really what I try to do both in my written work as well as in my classrooms is have a pedagogy of like compassion and openness. And let's talk and explore this topic together rather than going in with absolutes and shaming and, everyone needs to turn vegan overnight or they're, a bad person, that kind of thing. And really bringing people into a deeper sense of reconnecting to themselves and to their relationship to the non-human world. So I'm going to read part of sort of the latter part of my chapter where I outline some sort of suggestions or ideas for how we can start to heal our disconnection. And so I argue that, first we must heal our disconnection from our non-human kin. And as part of this healing, we must resensitize ourselves to animal suffering, squarely facing the reality of what we have done to our more vulnerable animal relatives. And I'm sort of jumping around a little bit in here because this gets quite long. And then I argue that the second dimension of healing involves re-examining our relationships with our diverse culinary lineages. Because food is not only about sustenance, but it is also about pleasure, connection, tradition. Sarah, you talk quite a bit about that in your chapter. So I talk about, citing some of the other work of like Indigenous, Mexican American, and African American food activists who argue that, yeah, today we might think of vegan food as very white and not traditional ethnic foods, but many of these folks are arguing that actually pre-colonization and enslavement, of course, this is not true in every single society across the globe, but many, many cultures from Africa to Mexico to South America to, all over the globe had more plant-forward diets. They may not have been vegan or use that term, but meat was a supplement. It wasn't at the core. And so that it's actually kind of the modern industrial meat as the center of every meal is actually the more non-traditional way of eating that people have started to think of as traditional. And I talk about my own lineage as a Indian American from the Hindu tradition and about, challenging there's a lot of vegetarianism in our tradition, although by means not everyone. But dairy is still a huge part of our culinary tradition. And so, but there's a lot of romanticization of the sacrifice of the quote mother cow, giving her milk, endlessly, right? Which kind of obscures the exploitation that happens. And then I write third, and perhaps the most challenging will be the healing between vegans and non-vegans in our ecological and social movements. Vegans charge omnivorous environmentalists with hypocrisy, noting that animal agriculture is one of the most damaging influences on the earth. On the other hand, non-vegans who care about the planet may find vegans to be inflexible, judgmental, and unrealistic. I have been in spaces where the dialogue broke down between a vegan activist and an ecologist who believed in regenerative agriculture, where one party was so upset they had to leave the room. Yet both parties agree that industrial animal agriculture is unethical and unsustainable and must be replaced by a saner system. And so what I argue is that the only way we can start to dismantle the animal industrial complex is for those who are vegan, those who are not vegan, but who are, quote, reducitarians, seeking to cut back on animal foods, those who consider themselves conscientious omnivores, to actually come together rather than continually, challenging each other, to come together on what we can agree upon, which is the problem of widespread industrial agriculture, and also having spaces to talk to each other rather than yell at each other. And I envision carefully facilitated spaces where all who seek to live more kindly, whatever their dietary practices, can share in dialogue rather than just debate about these issues. Within such spaces, we would come together to share our grief for what has been done to animals and the earth, our personal stories and struggles of figuring out how to eat and consume ethically, and visions for a more compassionate and just food system. So I think for me, it's about, I have a very strong vegan ethic, but I feel like the bridge building needs to happen for wider scale, change to happen rather than, thinking that everyone's gonna join me in turning vegan. Okay. So I spoke about some connections I saw between my work and yours, Sara, in terms of sort of reconnecting to, our lineages. And I really enjoyed reading your chapter, which is titled Xicana Mothering with Indigenous Food Systems, Reconnecting with Mesoamerican Ancestral Knowledges Through Frameworks of Intergenerational Food Justice as a Form of Activism. And your chapter weaves together the relationships of ancestral foods and lineage, mothering, and place. Could you frame your chapter a bit and read a section from it?
Sure. Thanks, Alka. As you're reading, I was thinking we grew up about 2 hours from each other in Illinois. I'm from Northwest Illinois, but a very rural area. And Alka grew up not that far, really.
Had a totally different relationship. I was thinking about that as I read it too. I was like, I did not grow up watching. I just thought all the food came from packaged in plastic in the grocery store. Because I grew up in an urban area.
Right. And so, yeah, I just wanted to to share, like, just that was coming up for me as I heard you, talk about your chapter. And I really love our sub-theme, Jeanine, of Edges of Transformation. That really spoke to me as I was rereading the book as well, as somebody who grew up in a very rural area, but in kind of like the traditional agriculture, right? Like massive agriculture. There was no permaculture happening where I was from at all, but I love it. And when I moved to the Bay Area and started taking permaculture classes, I was just blown away by this idea of the edges. And as someone from a marginalized community growing up in rural Illinois, I felt like I was always at the edges. And so I thought that this book was, just really spoke to me. And then the section, I think, so you put me in the section on kinship, which is like so perfect, right? Because my chapter is about kinship, not just among humans, right? But also kinship with the land and kinship with plants. And I love that you put in there kinship as a way to decolonize and recreate what kinship means, by birthing multi-species allyship that pulls from ancestral lineages and invokes a pathway toward our future. And that's what I was getting to in my chapter. And it's something that I had, been thinking about for a long time. And I don't think I realized that your first edition of this book came out in 2016. And that was the same year that my first child was born. And as I was thinking about this chapter, I was thinking, wow, at almost no time in their life, like they were born in July and Trump was elected in November, right? And so there's this kind of this experience in their lives and of your book, right, which I think of as a baby in a sense, right? You birth this with a much longer gestation, I'm sure. What that's like, right? To exist in the world under this kind of leadership. And so I just want to say, I think of writing as a ceremony. Anytime I write, whether it's my dissertation or chapters or anything I write, I approach it as a ceremony. And this is how I approach this chapter. And so this chapter for me is really a prayer. It's a prayer for my children. It's a prayer for all children. It's a prayer for my community, right? And it's a prayer for other communities who live in diaspora, whether chosen or forced diaspora. But it is a prayer for reconnection and reconnection through kinship ties. And so one way that I made it a prayer is I divided my chapter into five sections actually. In my first section, I called in the direction of the East and the element of fire. And in that section, I talked about Xicana spirituality. In the next section, I called in the direction of the West and the element of water. And I talked a little bit about my Xicana identity. In the next section, and this is the section I'm going to talk more about this evening, I called in the direction of the North and the element of wind, and really the practice of mothering as a verb, mothering for liberation. In the fourth section, I called in the direction of the South and the element of the earth. And in that chapter, I really looked at learning as ceremony, as education, as a place of potential healing. And in the final section was the centering, was the grounding of the chapter. And so in the first chapter, I talked a lot about my Xicana identity and spirituality and how they come together. And I identify as Xicana, Xicana, and that comes from the work of Ana Castillo. So in my community, and I've had this question many times from students, other people, how do you identify? And my community is so diverse. My grandparents are from Mexico, different parts of Mexico, Michoacan, Nayarit, Chihuahua. Some of my paternal side came through the Rio Grande Valley, San Benito, Texas. But all of them came to my hometown in Illinois because there was a steel mill. And so for three generations, family members have worked at that steel mill. And so in the Midwest, most people identify as Hispanic, because that is the term the government has given them and their role with that. That is not a term that has ever felt true to me. And so I have always gravitated towards the term Xicana, meaning that I was born here in the United States, but my roots are in Mexico. And then reading the work later on of Ana Castillo and really wanting to bring in my indigenous lineages. And this is what that spelling Xicana means, is bringing in these indigenous traditions. And doing a lot of work with curanderismo and healing has been really transformational for me, and has also laid the groundwork for my mothering journey. And so I just want to invoke the work of Andrea O'Reilly, who writes a lot about matricentric feminism. And I love the way that she uses mothering as a verb, and that mothering can come from many different people, regardless of gender. And I really love that. And this is what I get to in the chapter of my book on the North, when I call in the winds and the elders. So I began my mothering journey, about 9 years ago. And so I just want to contextualize this by saying that my mother had passed away, 8 years before that. And I was living far from home. I was living in the Bay Area. And so I was thinking deeply about this practice of mothering and the process of mothering. And how do you mother when you're not with your community? How do you mother without family? How do you do that? How do you learn those lessons? And really being welcomed into a community of mothers, right? And thinking deeply through my work as a professor, my work in research, as mothering for liberation. Because as I was pregnant with my oldest child, just like being so amazed at this process and wanting to honor all children and all parents. And so as I was thinking about how to tie back, how do I create a good foundation for my children, my family, and all children, right? From my work in curanderismo, my connection with plants, my plant ancestors, I thought, well, gosh, one way is through food. Everyone loves food, right? And growing up in the Midwest, we always had a garden. We were always, my parents lived, it's like they're just surrounded by acres and acres of corn. I just, as Alka said, I just had some of my first memories, kind of like Susan Griffin, is just like this, the corn like waving in the wind, and the smell of the dew on the corn in the summer, and time, like my idea of time being connected to the corn. And I just want to give a shout out to Jake Prendez here in Seattle and Damamish territory for this beautiful shirt he made of the goddess of the corn. And I was reminded of this experience that I had growing up with my grandfather. Both of my grandfathers were big gardeners. And my one grandfather, my Grandpa Joe, he had this little plot of land in town, and he had 8 kids. And so they always kind of farmed this land a little bit. It was just a couple acres. But because my town was based in this steel mill, that was where everyone worked. And I was born in the late 70s, so you probably remember or know, in the late 70s and 80s, there were a lot of strikes happening in steel mills. And so what he would do is every time that would happen, he would divvy up the land to different families, and each family could have a plot of land and they could garden it as they wished. And then as the grandchildren, it was still our responsibility to go and help garden and tend the garden. And so I just appreciated those. And so those stories have really become the foundation for my mothering. And I'll just read this very quickly. I'll just read this quote from these scholars, Teresa Mares and Devon Penna, who I know you know, Jeanine, who I think Devon was in the last book, who talks about environmental and food justice, and their parents, who are part of, quote, the Mesoamerican diasporic community, who use the cultivation of food to recreate their place-based cultural identities in the context of new landscapes. And in doing so, they regard food not as a nutritional commodity, but as that which encompasses a set of deep social and cultural relationships that foster community, cultural, and place-based identities. And then I end quote, the practice of gardening on varying levels became an overt practice of resistance to assimilation in a place and time in which assimilation was expected. And I really look at the gardens as altars, right? Altars for communities, altars for cultures and knowledge sharing. And I have taken great joy in gardening with my children. And it's such a gift to see them planting things, understanding, where food comes from, and learning together in this new land that we're both occupying. We all live in Seattle now, and so it's new here. This is a new climate, a new land, and so we're all learning together. So, yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to share about that, Alka. And I wanted Jeanine to talk about your section. I'm so excited to hear about, your chapter, which is entitled Seeing Clearly Through Cracked Lenses, and the approaches to power of worldview transformation by engaging multiple issues, as well as the power of straddling multiple positionalities. Can you tell us a little bit about your chapter?
Sure, yeah. And first, I just want to just thank you both again for saying yes to like being part of this and writing. And I love Sarah, your focus on writing as ritual. And yeah, and both of you, just your chapters just like spill over for like the love you have for all beings. Yeah, and so my chapter, and I didn't say it earlier, but I think there's 18 of us total, including the poetry decas and the cover art by my dear friend Raina Gentry, which I think is just fabulous. It's amazing. And so my chapter, Seeing Clearly Through Cracked Lenses, really focuses on often where like women of color, femmes of color, um, people of color are often termed like marginalized. So it can be kind of like self-authoring and like, oh, you're marginalized, you got to work harder, you've got to, and in a lot of ways, the seeing clearly through cracked lenses is about seeing the superpower that we have by inhabiting, and particularly folks that inhabit multiple positionalities. And I knew growing up that I was often perceived as like, like, what are you? Are you Black? Are you Indigenous? Or do you have some white hair? What? And I travel and I could kind of, superpower, I could fit into almost any country I went to, but often I was perplexing to people. And I remember as a child coming home from school and one of my classmates called me a mulatto, and my parents were like furious about that and like, we are African Americans, and that's great. And though it didn't kind of express like full identities, and ironically it wasn't until the first premiere of this book, my aunt Louise, who's now passed on, I asked, she raised her hand and said, we're multiracial. And I was like, we are multiracial. I already knew that, but just having other family members claim that. And so whether someone's multiracial or they straddle different nationalities, if they straddle different ecozones, political parties, religious identities, genders, like there's all these intersections. And if you really like unpack it, pretty much everyone has this. There's very rarely someone who can say, I'm just one thing, yet our overculture encourages us to be just one thing and to compare ourselves to like this standard. And so by kind of, I always picture it as like this glass wall in front of me and throwing a rock at it and just like not shattering but cracking, and actually from being able to break down that barrier, I can actually step into my full power and offer that to others. And so it's really a superpower. So I'll read a short bit from my chapter, and this one's on the sections on off-centered worldviews. So experiencing the dark night of a soul, a sacred wound, initiation rites, or a disorienting dilemma are clear examples of how one's worldview is broken and one is presented with the opportunity to develop a larger perspective. While all of these, to some extent, emphasize the responsibility to bring this larger perspective to the individual's actions in the world, the descriptions tend to focus on the solitary path and a unitive universal consciousness. They're events that cracked one's lenses of seeing reality, yet might be viewed as anticipated developmental episodes of the healthy life path. Moreover, they imply that the person experiencing the disorientation was previously immersed in a consensus reality based on the accepted norms of society, and the disorienting event shifted the individual into a larger view. There are many individuals whose experiences are not centered within this consensus reality, what is identified as the common experience of society by their backgrounds, with differences of race, gender, class, sexuality, physical ability, and other forms of distinction. Within our society, these are distinctions that have led to marginalization and disproportionate levels of power based on differences. While marginalized peoples are generally at a disadvantage in the context of worldview expansion, they often hold greater power through having experiences that cause them to question the mainstream. And moreover, with the acceptance that our current ecological and social crisis is caused to a large extent by the problematic Western worldview, having an off-centered worldview may be powerful in transforming the dominant paradigm. This seems particularly true when one holds an identity that comes from multiple intersections of race, gender, class, and other distinctions that do not permit one to sit solidly in a single grouping. A person who has many experiences of identity that do not fit within the majority has, through critical reflection and action, the potential of holding an expanded worldview. Hence, by being off-centered, one possesses power to shift the worldview to hold multiple, often conflicting worldviews. So I'll stop there. And I think there's just so much power in that right now, in terms of everyone, no matter how we identify, can really self-reflect, critically self-reflect on their truer story, rather than the story that we've inherited and been enculturated. Are you from a farmer? Are you from this? What's your real identities? What are the things you really believe and care about? And actually embrace our differences and start to work with it in a way that honors others' differences, and in a way that we actually start to meet our different edges rather than kind of being like, well, you're not like me, so I don't want to be part of you. Um, yeah. So, yeah. And I know we just have a few minutes left before we get into questions from the audience. So I wanted to shift us into one more question. And that's maybe I'll bring these together. And so we always in the all these social movements, particularly in the women's movement, there's a saying, the personal is political. Uh, And I'm wondering how this relates to our paths with ecological and social healing. And I know we've mentioned that a little bit. And then also just to maybe name some encouraging words for the longer term vision and actions that we need right now. And as one of our contributors and my mentor, Belby Rooks, often asks, what does healing look like? And what's the most important work we can be doing right now? So I don't know if either of you want to jump in.
I can start. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I was thinking about how I would distill this. And we kind of started talking about the election and all the turmoil that's going on in our world. And I really feel that a lot of the healing has to start with unplugging just a little bit, not to be aware of what's happening, but unplugging from the constant fear that's being pumped into all of us and the anxiety, and coming back to our bodies and coming back to our connection with our own spirits. Because I think that's the foundation that then allows us to connect with, connect more deeply with the people around us, connect with the land, connect with the trees. And then, of course, as I talk about, connect with what's happening with the non-human world, whether it's our companion animals or like thinking about where the food on our plate came from. And that really ties to me with this concept of the personal being political, because every single action that we take, from what we put into our bodies, what we consume, what we buy, how we treat each other, how we even treat our own bodies, has political ramifications. And so I think a lot of it has to do with taking the time to slow down a little bit and be more conscious of our own relationship to our bodies and to the environment around us as part of the foundation for how we create a deeper shift in consciousness, and then that ends up shifting, hopefully the political landscape.
Gosh, what do we do in these times, right? I mean, I think it can be healing to just keep showing up. And it sounds really simple and it's really hard. I talked at the beginning about there's a lot of fear in my community right now for just existing, going to the grocery store, sending your children to school, walking down the street, and continuing to show up for yourself, for your family, for your community. I think that there is the possibility for healing there, and that connection, right, is powerful. This summer, I was very lucky to have a sabbatical, and I spent some time in the spring doing a lot of accompaniment work in courthouses with families who were going to meet with judges about their paperwork. And it was heartbreaking work. And I thought, well, gosh, I could stay here in Seattle and I can continue this work, and it's good work. Or I can take my kids home and they can learn how to swim this summer and they can be with their family. And that's what I did. I took my kids back to Illinois and they got to play with their cousins and they got to sit with their elders and they got to help their 96-year-old aunt, walk down the street. And so having those places of joy and those opportunities for connection was deeply healing for myself, and I hope that that's what my children remember when they look back on this time in their lives, that was the summer that these are the kinds of opportunities. And I know that that's not true for everybody. Not everybody can do that, right? But even if it means just, kind of Alka said, just stop scrolling, be present, put your phone down in the evening. And I know as a parent, it's really hard to do that. It's really hard to do that with kids. And for our souls, I think it's vital.
Yeah, these are such like beautiful reflections and like wisdom. I'm definitely gonna have to watch this after and like take some notes and drop in more. Um, yeah, and it occurs to me that the term the personal is political came out in like the 60s and 70s when there were the interlocking kind of women's movements, animal rights movement, LGBT movements, environmental movements, um, civil rights movements, and um, I studied them for so long growing up, and now here we are, and it feels like the personal is so much more political than I ever realized it would be in our lifetimes. So I'm just noting that, and I fully agree in terms of slowing down. I've been often, I'm a long-term meditator, and I've just been really tapping deeply into practice and also deeply into practice with what it feels like to be in community with other people and to be sensitive enough to notice what's going on for them, to maybe find if they're a stranger, maybe find like those soft edges where there might be a opening to connect with. And same thing with like place and being in place, and realizing just as Alka's work, all of our work, that there's deeper allies beyond the human world. And I know I would gander, and I pretty much know that all three of us are at CIS, and probably everyone who's at CIS, or most folks that are at CIS, have a draw to spirituality, and that's part of our mission. And so I definitely feel that this time period allows me to not live in a flat world and to try and tap out a little bit more into the resources that we don't necessarily take the time to experience. And I appreciated what Alka was saying about being embodied and feeling our emotions, but all of our like sensuous capacities and our intuition and our spirituality, but also our ferocity in being able to show up to the collective suffering that's going on right now and staying with it. But you being able to tap into all of our resources so that we can. And I'm kind of in the camp of just being ready for whatever. And so always being prepared, so I'm not like, yeah, that I'm ready. Hmm. Okay, gosh. Well, I know it's time for audience questions, and I know there's probably, let me get into the first one. And so, okay, and audience, thanks for questions. As extractive industries and climate change threaten Indigenous food sovereignty, how do you see the role of non-Indigenous allies in supporting without appropriating these healing practices? Sarah, do you want to start with that one? And do you want me to read it again?
Sure.
Yeah. As extractive industries and climate change threaten Indigenous food sovereignty, how do you see the role of non-Indigenous allies in supporting without appropriating healing practices?
Yeah, that's a that's a great question. And it's a dance, I think. And I think there's a difference between appreciation and appropriation, right? And I think a lot of people come with appreciation, and being open to the conversation around appropriation, right? Which can be, can feel like the commodification of our culture, commodification of our rituals and traditions and foods. Um, and so I think I think of this gallery space here in Seattle. It's one of the only gallery spaces in the whole entire Pacific Northwest that's dedicated to Chicano culture. And I often, a lot of people I see in there are not Chicano. And I think that I love that. I'm like, yes, they've created a space right? Where everyone is welcome to come and look at the art and be in conversation and cook together. We have cooking class, there's cooking classes, right? And so it's a sharing of traditions, right? But as I always ask my students too, is like, well, what are your traditions? What foods are from your lineages, you know? And I think that is really exciting. My children are mixed, and so they're half Mexican and half Swedish and German. And so we talk a lot about those kinds of foods too. What is it like to grow foods from Sweden? What is it like to, what did they eat? We talk about a lot of those kind of like nuances in food. And I think a lot of these kids who are growing up mixed race are so exciting because they're carrying these like very rich lineages within them, and they're very excited to talk about it. My 9-year-old was just telling me, oh yeah, we were in class and we were talking about, you know, our different traditions, and I was telling about this you know, this dish they love tamales. They call themselves tamale boy. That they love tamales, and they wanted to share it. They were so excited to share it within their class and at their school. And so they asked, you know, can we make some tamales and take them to school? And so I think that's such a beautiful sharing of traditions. And yeah, I think I'll stop there. Alka, do you have anything to add to that question?
Gosh, I mean, there's so many different pieces to the question because I was like, well, which healing practices? And, but I think, a big thing, and I actually could do more around this too, as not someone who's not indigenous to this land, is really just like becoming more aware of what's happening with the indigenous like land rights and food sovereignty battles, and like supporting financially if we can, some of those struggles. And then if that's not a way of like, um, yeah, showing appreciation for the basic concepts, a lot of the concepts that I've learned from Indigenous scholars and activists is around relationship, reciprocity, not that those aren't in other cultures, but the way that it's been framed, right? Like, even if we're talking about, or, consuming animals, what was the relationship with that animal before that animal got to your plate, right? And I don't think that's an appropriation. I think that's recognizing the ethical wisdom in that, perspective, and seeking to apply that in our own lives.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would add, well, agree with but what both of you said, and also add that there's lots of organizations that are indigenous that actually want you to plant their seeds and grow food so it's sustainable. And as Alka said, like just really finding out about what's going on with organizations, supporting their efforts with tribes, with groups, and then to really be aware of not appropriating any rituals at all, but obviously any rituals or ceremonies in terms of food, but anything, because a lot of folks don't realize that there was 100-year period in this country, over 100-year period, where First Nation peoples weren't able to practice their spirituality. And it wasn't until the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed, I think in the 70s, that happened. And then they still couldn't practice because a lot of those lands had been taken. And often people don't realize that rituals and ceremonies are actually literal, and they're not metaphors. I mean, yeah, so just not taking any ritual or ceremonies from people unless the entire group has given you permission, which is quite rare. Okay, so let's see. Then the next question, given that food is ancestral connection, pleasure, and tradition, how can we resensitize ourselves and bring empathy to the dining table, even around cultural traditions that involve non-vegan foodways? Alka, that seems up your alley.
Really great question.
Right.
Yes, well, the term vegan is a very modern Western term, so there are many other traditions that would claim to have, vegan lineages necessarily. But as I mentioned earlier, many traditions are always evolving, and many vegan activists from various cultural traditions have been, saying that if we go back far enough, right, a lot of these called meat was not necessarily the center or the staple of every diet, though it may have become more and more so with colonization and with more of the westernization of the food system and availability. So I think that's the first step is like actually reclaiming the plant-based foods that have been part of one's tradition. But there's a Indigenous activist named Margaret Robinson who comes from the Mi'kmaq people, and she's like, well, yeah, my people actually ate a lot of meat, right? But she's vegan as an urban vegan and says, for me, I recognize that my people ate meat, but there was this relationship between the hunter and the animal that was killed. They said prayers. They asked for that spirit of that animal to, if we could take their life to feed their families, right? And she's like, that's not what's happening when you're going to, the Safeway and buying your meat in a plastic. And so for her, it was about, I'm going to go to the ethos of my people rather than necessarily all the specific foods that they ate, right? For me personally, many people think that all Hindu Indians are vegetarian. That's not true, but a certain percentage are. And I do come from a vegetarian lineage. But as I, mentioned earlier, dairy is a big part of that. And for me, but it's like I've been taught this concept of ahimsa, nonviolence toward all living beings. And maybe it was different back in the day when someone had their cow in their backyard and their calves got to drink all the milk they needed and there's some milk left over. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't there, right? But again, it's like if I want to live according to that ethos, I make my chai with all kinds of non-dairy milk now, right? So I still get the aroma and the spices and all of that without having to have, the dairy milk. But I also would say that what I've found in working with lots of, colleagues, students, peers, is sometimes what keeps people from wanting to go embrace more plant-based food is this idea that I have to do it all or nothing. Well, if I start calling, and there's some, people, there are vegans who will be like, but you had that when you went to grandma's house, you weren't vegan, so you're not a real vegan. And maybe technically they're not, but I think the world needs a lot more people who like, rather than a few small percentage of like level 5 perfect vegans, like a lot more people who are like radically shifting to plant-centered, if not fully vegan diets in terms of like reducing the demand, right? And so if that means you're like, okay, I'm going to be vegan, I've talked to this with like other students, like 6 out of 7 days a week, but that seventh day I go eat with my family and they just don't get it, you know? And if that's what you need to do to feel connected to your culture, to your people, then that's one way of doing it without it being an all or nothing, right? But I think the biggest thing for me is recognizing that, um, there's so much of a misperception. Again, it depends on where people's ancestors were geographically and what the climate was, but there's a misperception that many cultures had food that were meat or animal foods was eaten at every single meal. That was more of a privileged thing that came about with the expansion of industrialized animal agriculture and the standard Western diet. Yeah.
Right. Thanks so much. Yeah. Like the vegan curious.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So another question, I think, oh, this seems up my alley a bit. Eco-psychology and social justice are two fields that sometimes attract different communities. What have you learned about building bridges between people who may enter ecological work from different doorways or with different priorities? Oh, I actually love this question because when I first got into eco-psychology, I was I actually had been studying a lot and also started teaching multicultural education. It was my first like teaching gig, but I was also doing my master's in cultural eco-psychology at the time. And I was also very interested into the way adults change their worldviews. I geek out about that, obviously. And I came across some actual challenges in the classroom around working with, kind of more conservative, predominantly white student body teaching multicultural education, and one of my colleagues turned me on to the work of Milton Bennett and the developed model of intercultural sensitivity. And the same time, I was in eco-psychology, really enthused by the work of our late and beloved Joanna Macy in partnership with Molly Young Brown, with the reasons that people don't look at the ecological crisis. And so both of those developmental models kind of have different stages. And I realized that while they come from different approaches and are looking at different issues, it's the same. And so I started pairing those together. And by bringing together social justice and ecological issues, usually folks have a stake in one of those areas, and they just pair in a way that allows folks to kind of engage more than just a single issue. And then when we break it down further, you can really look at that just all that ecological and social justice issues just go hand in hand. And there's no instance of large scale racism that's actually not about the acquisition of natural resources. And so, yeah, I feel like eco psychology and social justice, when you get into the work of it and really frame it and get people to reflect on it and bring in their own stories and relationships, it's like, oh, why did we never learn about this? I don't know if either of you want to add to that. Okay, I'll move on. We've got a couple more questions too, so let's keep moving. Oh, here's hope can be so difficult to come by during these unprecedented times. Are you able to find it? And if so, how do you find and channel hope with so much fear?
Mhm.
I could start with that one. And yeah, I maybe, and I don't know if Alka and Sarah feel similarly, but I feel like I've been working around these issues for so long, and there's just been like kind of back to like Joanna Macy and others talking about this great unraveling that's coming, and we've been in it for quite a while. And right now it feels like we're just in the thick of it. And so I've just been expecting it. And I feel like when we're engaging, like really engaging the suffering of our world and like the specifics of it, and bringing it in a way that we digest our emotional responses, we extend our capacity to like feel deep sorrow and feel deep joy. I find that like ecological and social um, communities are often the like biggest moments of laughter that I have. And so hope comes so much in terms of like that human connection and also our resourcefulness. Yeah, and also like we wouldn't care about all this stuff if we weren't sentient beings with these immense capacities and surrounded by so much beauty and wonder. So I try to just tap into that all the time.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think teaching, right? Being with our students, having these conversations, going really deep is like incredibly, I feel like this is where like these are the spaces everyone should be in, right? Where we can like really share with our full selves, body, mind, and spirit. And it just moves me so much. But also what I was talking about at the very beginning when I was talking about the real fear in terms of the loss of reproductive rights, what I found also so helpful, kind of holding both, is like the incredible network of midwives and doulas around the country, especially midwives and doulas of color who have, right, they have this constellation of support for all birthing people, right? And it just blows me away the organization, the planning, the connections that have been in place, right, for much longer, right? It's not like, oh, this just happened. And I find that so hopeful and so it just brings me so much joy to know that that's happening, right? As much as I can get in the, oh my gosh, I'm so scared it's going to happen. I also know that I can call, my midwife and say, how can I support? How can I support you and your clients, right? And, seeing my kids' preschool in Oakland and the amazing work they're doing with BIPOC kids in Redwoods, right? It's just like so healing and so engaging. And I have so much hope for this younger generation. So, Alka?
I mean, I agree with everything that both of you said, and there's so many layers to this, but I would start with saying, like, to ask yourself, what is it that you are hoping for? Because if we're hoping for, a fully social and ecologically just world to happen tomorrow, it's not happening tomorrow. I mean, I think it can happen in our world, right? But I think what we can start with is hope in our own capacity for goodness and for love and for compassion. And, you mentioned Joanna Macy earlier, Jeanine, and Joanna Macy talks about this active hope. She's written this a whole book about it, which is the hope that comes from the seeds that you're planting, the actions that you're taking, right? So it's like I can have hope that I can contribute to someone else's life or to bettering my own life because I'm taking actions that are leading to that. And then, I think also on a wider scale, it's recognizing that, yes, there's a lot of scary things happening and peoples who are being targeted, and there are things to be concerned about, but we aren't going to create change by being in a state of freak out. And so, and I think what gives me hope too is seeing that so many more people are having conversations about somatic healing, about healing in general, ancestral healing, spirituality. And I didn't see those conversations happening 10, 20 years ago, right? And that's what gives me hope because I think people are coming together now and developing more tools for being able to navigate the times that we have that we're dealing with.
Okay. Oof. Another question here. In these times, many of us are looking to lean on and to support our communities, but feel disconnected. Would you speak to the ways you're seeing people come together with an integral feminist lens, or suggestions for how we might begin to find our village?
I just spoke, but I'll just speak briefly to this. I know we don't have a lot of time, but this question is really close to my heart because I moved from California back to my hometown of Chicago almost 4 years ago. And finding community in middle age, when I work from home, it's been, something I've really had to work at, right? Like, okay, I'm gonna try this and join this group and meet these people. And like, there's no inbuilt community that's gonna be like vegan and everyone's into social justice and healing arts. And, so for me, it's been about how do I, like, keep reaching out and making the effort as an introvert, right? And I think that there's so many people today who are longing for connection and longing for community. And sometimes it takes like a lot of trial and error to find your people and find your tribe, and just don't give up. And one great piece of advice I heard from an online influencer named Dr. K was like, the only way we can solve loneliness is by focusing on alleviating somebody else's loneliness rather than our own. And that's how we build community, is by being the one to reach out and ask how someone else is doing without necessarily starting with, how am I going to, get my needs met right away? Like, we all want our needs met, but sometimes by focusing on what we can give to others, or like what, grassroots organizations helping, immigrant kids, like the work Sarah's doing, or, that's doing planting gardens and getting involved. And I think that's a really great way to find those types of communities. Yeah.
Gosh. This reminds me of at the very beginning of the pandemic in 2020, I was living in Oakland in a very tiny house with 2 babies and really not able to leave our home, and really feeling that question, like, what do you do? What can we do then? What can we do now? And in that moment, when there wasn't much to do, what I ended up doing is I took out the lawn. I just need to get outside. I needed to move. I needed my feet on the soil. And so I just went outside and I took out my entire lawn and I started planting native plants to California. And I hadn't really thought about them before. There was just like grass on my lawn. But I learned a lot about California by studying those plants, right? Really being in close relationship to those plants. And then recognizing, oh, these are the bees that come here. Oh, these are the butterflies that come here. Oh, these are the birds, right? And that practice was incredibly nourishing and healing for me. And I remember kind of after the restrictions started to be lifted in the pandemic, I went down to Lake Merritt in Oakland and I was walking around the lake. I used to walk around the lake a lot. I used to live right around, a block up. And I was walking around and I was like, oh, there's the California poppies. Oh, now I knew these plants. And it was a moment I just stopped and I was like, oh, these plants have always been here. They never left, right? And it was this moment of like, oh, I was never alone. Even in those kind of like dark nights of the soul during the pandemic that many people went through, recognizing that, oh, there's so much more that holds me, not just as a human being, but as a spirit on this earth. And that has brought me to this day so much grace in these difficult times. And I think today that still holds true. I mean, the shutdown today, it's like, what do I do? I don't know what to do. I can go to my garden. I can have my little pot that I can start to, think about, okay, what's this going to look like in the winter time? And just remembering, right, I'm not alone, not alone in this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. Yeah, like, I see you. But yeah, I feel so similar in terms of loneliness. Like, we're never alone, that we're always surrounded by other, whether it's non-human beings, place, that there's just so much love available. And I find that I have so many people in my life that are willing to drop into like depth as long as I show up in depth. And sometimes it's like strangers, or I just do the things that I love, like working my community garden plot, and there's all these other people doing the same, and suddenly we're having like conversations and exchanging, vegetables or tips. And same, just finding, I love the term, and I wrote a piece about, not in this book, but called ambiguous, unusual couplings. And so, like, how do we also move past the people that already reflect who we are, and yeah, so like, can I befriend someone who voted a different way that I did, or has a different religion, not that I have a religion, but than I do, or yeah, thinks differently. I actually love hanging out with elders, because they think I'm helping them. I'm like, I'm doing a little, but I'm learning so much from you. And so yeah, just realizing that if we put the effort in, and kind of break open our hearts a little bit, like there's just so many relations wanting to form. Um, yeah. And I know that's all the time we have for questions, but I also just want to honor the relations that we have in our CIS community, which includes everyone who's on this call, and really just gratitude to Sara and Alka and to CIS and to all, the beings of Earth, all sentient beings, and just, yeah, that we keep showing up. Um, and yeah, I hope folks enjoyed this, and that you'll read our essays in the book, and keep coming to CIS events.
Thank you so much, Jeanine. Thank you for holding the space.